Um, Welcome to you all from across Australia. It's really exciting to be here. Before I get started and introduce myself and the webinar we've got today, I'd just like to first acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands that we're all meeting. For me in Geraldton, that's the Amagu, Nagaja and Willinoo people of the Southern Yamatji Nation, and Bush Heritage has a deep respect and ongoing relationship with Aboriginal people across Australia and in all of our operations, both on our reserves and on the partnership programs we support. So I just want to acknowledge how important that is for us as an organisation, and also acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders and the emerging leaders on the lands that you're all gathering on today. So as I said earlier, thank you all for dialing in. I know people's lives are very busy at the moment, and the chance to connect with our supporters is always a really special opportunity, particularly given the challenging times we're all facing in different ways at the moment. For those that haven't met me, I'm Luke Bayley. I'm talking to you from Geraldton. I'm the Executive Manager for Western Australia and South Australia. Jodie Gunn, who's my colleague, used to oversee the South Australian operations, but we've had a small restructure just to try and align a few priorities, and now I'm fortunate to have both Western Australia and South Australia under my leadership, which I'm really excited about. And there are lots of similarities between the arid rangelands, which we're going to hear more about today with Clint and Meredith and Tony, and some of our signature reserves in the Midwest of WA, like Charles Darwin, Yarradi and Hamlin. So I just a little bit about myself. I have been with Bush Heritage for 8 years. I've had the privilege of meeting people like yourselves, our wonderful supporters, for many years now, and I just am so grateful to be part of an organisation that is backed by people who believe in looking after our amazing country, our amazing nature and regional landscapes. And I was the Charles Darwin Reserve Manager for 5 years out there on Buddy Mire country, which was a real privilege. So I got to get my hands into practical land management work, and following that role, I was the Healthy Landscape Manager for the Midwest region. So I was able to take a more regional leadership role, and I've been fortunate enough to secure an executive leadership role, which enables me to support our great teams across South Australia and WA, which is and why I'm also hosting this forum. So, and the only other element that I really wanted to share with you is that in this forum, you'll be hearing about the wonderful work that Clint and his team are leading out at Bonbon, but also about the impact that Bush Heritage is having in realising or working towards realisation of some of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which were established in 2015. And I think the really important thing about that is that as supporters and as staff, we all realise that our work is having a really important impact at a local level, so at our reserve level, at a community level, so with the stations and other nature reserves that are around our properties and where we're doing good science and land management, at a state level, because always, our organisation is leading conversations about how to do things better, how to improve science, how to improve engagement and involvement with traditional owners. All those things, we're at the cutting edge, I believe, in nature conservation and traditional owner engagement across Australia and internationally. And it's important we recognise that it's groups like Bush Heritage that are helping contribute to goals that have been developed by the United Nations to make our world a better place to live for both ourselves now, but most importantly for our children and our grandchildren. And the goals that we're working towards help realise are really goals, and you can look up the sustainable goals from the UN on the web, but there's 4 goals that Bush Heritage are contributing to, and one of those is Goal 13, which is climate action. One of them is Goal 15, which is life on the land, which you're going to hear a lot about today. Another one is Goal 17, which is partnerships, which Bush Heritage places a lot of emphasis on, and you'll also hear about that today. And the other one is Goal 3, which is good health. And through Clint's presentation, you're going to hear how Bush Heritage are doing things at a local level, but how that feeds up and has an international and global impact. So I really do thank you all for your support in that, because it wouldn't be possible without your volunteering efforts and also your financial support. It just makes it all possible. So that's really it from me. I'll be helping to grease the wheels of this webinar and making sure that everybody is having an enjoyable experience and getting something out of it. But I'm now going to introduce Clint, our Reserve Manager at Bonbon. And for those that haven't met Clint, well, you're in for a treat. He's a great fella and a great leader out there at Bonbon. Clint grew up in Newcastle in New South Wales and spent a lot of time in nature, surfing, fishing, playing sport and spending time with his grandparents on their rural property. He also spent 15 months in Africa after leaving school, which provided a sort of a revelation to how lucky we are in Australia and how important it is to do meaningful work. And you know, how to step out of your comfort zone and take a risk to make a difference in the work that you do, whether that's volunteering or in your paid work. So Clint's done that. He's out on Bonbon, a huge nature reserve that Bush Heritage have run for many years now, and he's living out there with Kate and a small team. He's been out in the South Australian rangelands for 11 years, so he's got a lot of experience about what he's going to be presenting on to you shortly. And he's worked for a couple of different organisations in that environment, not just Bush Heritage. And Kate and Clint started their journey with Bush Heritage as a volunteer, so back in 2010. So it's great seeing people come with a passion, not know exactly how to get into an organisation like Bush Heritage, start volunteering and then end up becoming critical team members employed to do the work. So I guess on that note, I'll just pass it over to Clint to start the presentation. And thanks again for all of you joining us. I can see that we've got 95 attendees from across Australia, so it's a great turnout and we really appreciate you dialing in and we look forward to hearing from you. And I will also introduce you to Meredith and Tony, who are part of this in more detail after Clint does his presentation. So over to you, Clint.
So welcome. I'm excited to be giving this talk. I've done one other of these bush chats before, but not in this kind of virtual forum. So it is amazing. We wouldn't normally be able to fit 100 odd people in the Bonbon office here, but here we are. We've got it. So yeah, for those of you who don't know much about Bonbon or where we are in the South Australian rangelands. We're about 600 or 700 kilometres north of Adelaide, and in what is currently sort of prime sheep country. The environment's really interesting where Bonbon is. It's a long and skinny reserve, and it crosses two major bioregions in South Australia. So we've got the Gawler bioregion to the south of the property and the Stony Plains bioregion to the north. So that in itself, those two broad bioregions bring a lot of diversity to the property. Our average rainfall out here is 160 millimetres a year, although the last couple of years has been, last year we had 25% of that. So far this year we've had 50% of that average. There's no natural permanent surface water out here. So it is true desert country, Bonbon. This region was originally occupied by the Kukara, Wirrungu, Yankunytjatjara and Untitled people. And in 2011, I believe it was, Untitled Maru Yankunytjatjara Aboriginal Corporation were granted native title over a big area, a big chunk of land in this area, which Bonbon falls within that. So we're lucky to be working with those guys as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's a lot of evidence of their history across Bonbon. We've got a lot to learn still, but just by getting around on the property, you see grindstones and napping floors and all that sort of history there. The region has had a relatively short pastoral history. It's about 150 years. So this country wasn't really opened up for pastoralism until the 1860s, when I guess it was Sturt came through, mostly because of the dry conditions and lack of water. But in the 60s, there was a big boom when the drilling technology came along to be able to drill bores to access good water. So the big development in the pastoral industry has happened relatively recently, which again has contributed to the real conservation value of these areas, and Bonbon in particular out here, in that it hasn't had a really long history of pastoralism. And yeah, in 2008, Bush Heritage came along and thought it was a gem and snapped it up, and now we're managing Bonbon for conservation values, and we haven't looked back really. So some of the reasons why Bush Heritage considered Bonbon special are listed here, and we call these our key conservation targets. These have evolved a little bit over the last 10 or 12 years, but basically they are the mulga woodland on sandy plains, which in this map is characterised by the green there, the western mile over pearl blue bush. So the mulga woodlands, they are listed as a threatened ecological community in South Australia. The western mile over pearl blue bush is a big ecological community, and there's a lot of it in South Australia, but it's poorly conserved and it's mostly under pastoralism. Chenopod shrublands on buckshot plains, which is starting to get up into that stony deserts bioregion that I mentioned earlier. And sort of mostly the northern third of the reserve is made up of that key conservation target. And that's important habitat for endemic birds and cryptic birds. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later. And then the labyrinth land system and ephemeral wetlands. So there's an extensive catchment in Bonbon, which terminates in a big lake in the middle of the property that you can see there on the map. And when we get those boom years of rainfall, there's really important habitat for water birds, drought refugia, just generally across the board for all the amazing animals out here. And it's also it seems to be the key habitat for the southern hairy-nosed wombats. So I'll just talk a little bit about each of those KCTs specifically, key conservation targets. The first one was mulga woodland on sandy plains. It's fairly extensive across Bonbon, mostly covers the sort of the central and eastern parts of the property and to the south. It's an amazingly diverse land system, and I'm a little bit biased, but I would say in those really good rainfall years, the wildflower shows would rival any of those that West Australia can put out there for us. It's really beautiful country and really important for a lot of animals, particularly the seed-eating birds. We've got there's a lot of seed-eating birds that are reliant on this habitat. So we've got the budgerigars here, and in this image here, emus, zebra finches, mulga parrots, Burke's parrots, and wood swallows, which aren't seed-eating birds, but they're insectivores. So this land system attracts all those animals in. Lots of really grassy understory with tall mulga. It is quite fire prone, and we have had, the reserve has seen some severe fires in the 70s. A lot of people might remember the early 70s were quite wet years, I believe. It was before my time, but after those wet years across the country, there was big wildfires through this part of South Australia, and significant areas of the mulga woodlands burnt. We're still seeing the recovery of those woodlands today, and they have shifted a little bit in their dynamics because their fires were so extensive, and then probably the pressure from rabbits and grazing afterwards sort of halted the regeneration a little bit. But we are seeing some really good mulga recruitment in those fire affected areas now, and the grasslands are fairly healthy. So the Western Mile over Pearl Blue Bush. Now this is probably, in my opinion, one of the more picturesque landscapes across Bonbon. Again, there's a fair bit of it. This land system is sort of scattered throughout the reserve, and there's a lot more of it to the west. It's really beautiful country. Both the Western Mile, which is the bigger tree there, is an acacia, and they can live for hundreds of years. They're a big tree. It blows me away every time I see these trees, really big trees, how they can survive out here on such little rainfall. They're just amazing trees. They live for hundreds of years. And the pearl blue bush as well, which is that lower shrub in the understory there, the bluey grey shrub. It can also live for hundreds of years. And it's hard to believe sometimes, but they get really big sort of trunks on them. So they're really important for the habitat areas. The Western Mole create really nice shade and leaf litter. And under those Western Mole, there's quite often a lot of palatable species of forbs and herbs, grasses, and things that live in that little microclimate, which as I mentioned earlier, most of this landscape, most of the Western Mile over pearl blue bush in South Australia is under the pastoralism management. And when sheep and cattle get in under there and disturb all that, it kind of messes all that little really important microclimate up. There's some key species or key features within this landscape in the Western Mile over pearl blue bush, which we're really interested in. So the image on the left is a sandalwood. It's related to the quandongs. They were heavily harvested in this region about the 1940s, and we haven't been doing much specific work on them, but we just do monitoring ad hoc here and there and we look for them. And we've noticed very little recruitment. And I think that's generally across the board and in Western Australia as well. It's a similar story. We're not really sure why. There are some people working on that at the moment, but so the sandalwood are very important. And also this environment forms a biological soil crust on the surface. The technical term is a cryptogam, and they're made up of non-vascular plants such as mosses, lichens, and cyanobacteria. And that crust, it looks very benign. You probably wouldn't even notice it if you didn't know what you were looking for. But it's really important for soil stabilization in this environment. These very fragile, shallow soils need those cryptogams on top to stabilize them. And as they develop, you can see in the image there's someone holding a piece of that cryptogam. As they develop, they start to peel up like an orange peel that's been sitting in the sun for a little bit too long. It sort of gets the edges on it. And when that does that, then the wind blows and seeds from grasses and forbs and other wildflowers can get caught in those little gaps. And the next time it rains, it forms a bit of a microclimate for those seeds to germinate. So really important. If those cryptogams weren't there, a lot of the rain would hit the ground and just run off. And as mentioned, livestock can be very damaging to this fragile crust, which is very slow to develop. And we have seen over the last 10 years here at Bonbon, there's been some really good development of these biological soil crusts coming back, which is really exciting. So the chenopod shrublands on Buckshot Plains, I said the pearl blue, Western Mile over pearl blue bush was my favourite, but this is also a beautiful landscape. It's very open sort of country. The northern third of Bonbon is characterised by this landscape, but it's also scattered down through the western side, and that's mostly because we're pushing up into the Stony Deserts bioregion here. Very, very open and undulating country. Everyone comes out to Bonbon and laughs at us when we refer to the mountains and the valley floors. You spend enough time out here, your image of mountains starts to change, but there are some important drainage lines which flow through this very undulating country and down into the big wetlands through the middle and southern end of the reserve. But these chenopod shrublands also host hundreds of gilgais, which are shallow depressions in that landscape that accumulate moisture. And after rain, you'll be driving along and they literally look like a salad bowl out in the red dirt. They're just amazingly diverse little depressions in the landscape. Very important for refugia, for a host of small mammals and reptiles, and important for that general diversity in that region, in that landscape. So the chenopod shrublands, they are important here at Bon Bon because they host a range of birds, which are pretty important, and particularly the chestnut-breasted whiteface is endemic to this region of South Australia. So for any keen birdos out there, I'm sure this one is on the list. And yeah, it's a great little species. And then we've got the labyrinth land system and ephemeral wetlands. So this lake here is Lake Puckridge, and it's kind of the beating heart of Bon Bon almost. As I mentioned earlier, the catchment for this lake is pretty much the northern 2/3 of the property, and 99% of the catchment is within Bon Bon, which is really, really important and interesting thing. There's not many properties that you get that a full catchment on and able to manipulate or look after that whole catchment. So it's really great. This lake here is roughly 3,500 hectares, just for reference. And this landscape is really important for the freshwater the wetlands. Basically, there's countless fresh and saline wetlands that support an abundance of life through this habitat. It's been dry for a long time now. I think the last time I saw any significant water in any of these areas was in 2017. But we do get all the water birds and that sort of stuff. It's also a significant habitat for these two critters, the thorny devil on the left and the southern hairy-nosed wombats. We've seen a significant increase in activity of both these species over the last 3 or 4 years. And we're not sure why the wombats are increasing their activity into areas that we haven't really recorded them before, but we're keen to learn more. The thorny devils, again, there's been a big increase in activity, and the biggest area that we've noticed that increase is within about a 400 square kilometre area that we've been doing a lot of our predator management. So we think that our fox and feral cat management is having positive impacts on those guys. Southern hairy-nosed wombats are really interesting as well because we're at the northernmost extent of their range. There's not much known about them in these parts of South Australia, and a little bit like the Western Mile, I'm absolutely blown away that these guys can live out here in this environment. So I guess, we're talking about those topics. You can kind of figure out why we love Bon Bon. But as Luke mentioned, Kate and I have been here for 4 years now, living here permanently. We've been a part of the Bush Heritage family for 10 years. And it's just a great opportunity to do what we love and live in this amazing environment. That's Kate there. We had there was an internal competition during the isolation period to dress up in your formal wear, and we had a bit of a competition. So we were doing our grazing assessments in our wedding attire, formal attire. Where, the lifestyle here allows us to grow a lot of our own food, which is fortunate, being sort of 200 kilometres to the nearest IGA. We spend a lot of time in the garden growing greens, and our chooks keep us filled with eggs. And for any of you that might be lucky enough to come out and visit one day, I'll have to give you a slice of our Bon Bon sourdough. It's got that perfect little hit to it. So partnerships are really important to what Bush Heritage do, and we can't do what we do without partnerships in a lot of cases. We've got great relationships here with our locally based traditional owners at Bon Bon. We work with them fairly regularly throughout the year. So we've got Nikki Willis here on the left helping with sandpad monitoring, and the guys on the right have done a lot of rabbit warren mapping over the years, and are still busy doing more this year as well. There was a great quote that Nikki said to us, and I asked if I could share it. She said to us, "Bonbon is like a phone charger. When we're on country, we get energized. If we spend too much time away from country, our energy starts to fade." And it was just a really, really nice way of articulating that that need to be on country that traditional owners have, but also I think everybody has, and you know, in a lot of ways we're all lacking, and especially over the last 6 months. Our partnerships extend to the greater community as well. So last year we work a lot with the Landscapes SA board and the local group there, and we host things like Kids Days on country. These are all local kids from the stations around us, and it was a really great day. They came out and we looked for wombat tracks and thorny devil tracks, and spent time talking about what we do here at Bonbon. And for some of them, it was pretty challenging because it was the first time they'd sort of seen this country through a different lens, not the pastoral lens. But yeah, they just loved it, and it's great being able to be involved with the local community in that way. And so, yeah, I guess our two major partnerships in this area and with Bonbon is with the Underkidney Muddu Yunkinjara Aboriginal Corporation. We work with those guys to get cultural heritage surveys done to assist us with our management activities. And also we're working with them to get more on-country trips for traditional cultural knowledge sharing and things like that. And also Arid Recovery, who has been sort of a partner with Bush Heritage for a few years now, and they're based over in Roxby Downs, which is about 150 kilometres east of us, working with fenced reserve, and they've been working in this environment for 20 years now, I think. So it's a great to be part of those guys as well. We share knowledge and skills and staff and equipment, and it's great to have some like-minded people in the region as well. So that's pretty much my presentation, Luke. I'll pass it back to you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, and I'm more than happy to field them as they come through. I'm just going to stop sharing now.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Clint. That was a wonderful presentation, and it's just a snapshot too. I think you will all appreciate that what Clint's been able to share in, I think, 20 minutes or so is just a broad overview of the different elements. And as you can see, conservation land management is so much more than just feral animal control or erosion control. There's the deep relationships with the key stakeholders and working with traditional owners and working with the next generation of families as well. So there's all of that deep commitment that makes this work possible. So thank you, Clint, and thanks to the team. Before I throw over and introduce to Meredith and Tony, there's a few questions, and I think it might be good just to address one of them, and we'll try and get to the others later in the forum. But just a quick comment on feral animals, Clint, the type of feral animals that you have there, and just a brief summary maybe of how they're being managed.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's three main feral animals that we are actively managing here, and that's foxes, feral cats, and rabbits. Again, like the very short pastoral history, we're very fortunate here in that that's almost it. There are goats in the region, and goats have only been recorded on Bonbon once or twice in the 10 years. So, you know, when you talk about the threats of feral animals on a national level, having only three is a pretty good thing. We've got an extensive baiting program to manage the cats and foxes, and we're trialing some cat specific baits at the moment, as well as you know, targeted control with trapping and things like that. The rabbit management is done in numerous ways. There's been some extensive warren ripping projects funded through the Native Vegetation Council a few years ago, as well as more targeted fumigation and warren destruction and stuff like that. And we're also trialing some releases of the K5 virus, the Khaleesi virus, which will work on a more local level, and it's very target specific, only affecting rabbits.
Right.
But yeah.
I think there might be. Yeah, that's a good. I think there's a lot of questions coming through, so I just want to acknowledge that people will try and get to them, and through Meredith and Tony's presentation, there may be some more clarification, and then we will have a chance to delve into some more. And the only other thing I'd say is, from an organisational point of view, feral animal control is a major part of all of our land management. We try to look at a variety of methods, as Clint has highlighted. Baiting is obviously something we use. We try to minimise that for obvious reasons, but in some cases it's the only effective tool we have, and we use it very diligently and based on scientific methodology and best practice. But it's certainly not the only tool we have in the toolbox. We have other mechanisms, but fundamentally, when you're a land manager, you've got to deal with species, and you've got to make decisions that sometimes aren't things that you'd like to be making, but you've got to think of the native animals and the broader ecology and biodiversity, and we've got to intervene in appropriate ways and keep looking at ways of doing that the best and most effective we can. So we'll get back to that. It is an important area, and thanks for those questions. But it's a great pleasure now to introduce Meredith and Tony, who it's great when our staff talk and share their wealth of experience, but when supporters come on and also raise their hand and say, oh, hey, I'd love to share my experience with fellow supporters and volunteers and also our staff, it means a lot to us as an organisation, because that's how we function with the support and commitment of our supporters. So Meredith and Tony are sitting on Kangaroo Island at the moment, and they've been living there for 40 years. So a very wonderful place to be living, and it's had a difficult period over the last 12 months, which I'd like to acknowledge. Meredith spent her working career with Elders Agricultural Company, so she has a strong commitment to rural and regional Australia, and also understands the challenges facing people on the land. And Tony had a successful career in the car industry and has subsequently lent his hand to the building sector on Kangaroo Island. So a wealth of skills and experience there, which is incredibly valuable for regional communities. And Tony and Meredith first heard about bush heritage through Meredith's father, who was, like you all, a supporter and left a bequest to bush heritage, which we're really grateful for. Not just for the bequest, but for the fact that it also kept Meredith and Tony close to bush heritage, and have allowed them to find really meaningful involvement. So they felt stepping off where Meredith's father left was a great thing to do, and both have spent their childhoods in Port Augusta and have learned to love the arid lands that Clint's just taken you on a short journey through. And the bush is a very special place for them. And so I really want to thank them for their commitment to the Australian bush and to also bush heritage, and pass it over to Meredith and Tony to say a few words and host a little bit of a conversation with Clint out there at Bon Bon Station.
Thanks,
over
Luke.
to you.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, and thank you, Clint, for a wonderful presentation. It really made us feel like we were there. And we have been to Bon Bon a couple of times. The first time was in February last year when we did a month of caretaking, and that was our first look at Bon Bon, and Clint took us around fox baiting on our second day there, and that gave us a really good chance to just gauge what an enormous property it is. I just couldn't believe how big it was and how long it takes to get any jobs done there. But volunteering with bush heritage has actually given our life a really whole new meaning, hasn't it, dear?
Yeah.
Like mixing with people who share our values and giving us an opportunity to wander around in the bush that we love so much. So it's just an extra legacy that my father left us, really, that we were able to do all of this. And the other time we were at Bon Bon was for the pitfall trapping in November last year, and this is when we really got to experience working with a team of volunteers, and it was just such a wonderful social time, as well as really, really interesting, because we had no idea there were so many creatures that live on that country that you never actually see. You know, the nighttime creatures that come out and that live in the hole in the ground during the daytime. So I think that was the biggest thing for us, that we had no idea the country was so alive with living creatures. And we were struck when we arrived there, you know, coming in off the Stewart Highway, how healthy it looked. And, you know, there has been a drought in South Australia for a few years now, but even so, the Bonbon country looked so much healthier than some of the surrounding neighbours. And, you know, we feel for the neighbours, but it was just so heartening to see that Bonbon was surviving quite well through the drought. So, and of course, we've always got questions for Clint, and, you know, while we're up there, and now things come to mind to us. Because it's so big, Clint, we were wondering just how you have determined the number of species living on Bonbon, and if you have got a species list, and if you really know what you've got living there at the moment.
Yeah, it is. Well, as you got to experience, Meredith, it is a big property. I think I've failed to mention, but the property is 214,000 hectares, so roughly 500,000 acres. Yeah, it's a big property. We do a few different things throughout the year, supported by our rangelands ecologist who works across both properties in South Australia, and our other team members here. We're fortunate to have 2.5 staff. There's a part-time field officer as well, but we do pitfall trapping, which you guys came up for last year. So that's where we're surveying for small mammals and reptiles using pits in the ground. And that's fairly good. However, you know, on a property so big, we can only get around to so many sites. So we have tried to in the past put those sites in all the different land systems that I mentioned earlier. As well as that, we do annual bird monitoring, where I think there's 50 odd sites that volunteers have been going around to for the last 10 years doing annual bird monitoring. And that can be really good because of the boom and bust seasons. You know, sometimes it's rained and you get all the water birds in and things like that. And then we do just opportunistic sightings. So whenever we're out and about doing whatever we're doing, if we see something new or interesting, we record it down. And yeah, Bush Heritage we use some technology which helps us record all that stuff and sends it up into the cloud and collates it all now. So it's, you know, becoming a lot easier to develop those species lists and get them all into one place, that's for sure.
Great. Well, and also, you know, I have a passion for the vegetation on the drylands, and as you mentioned, they do support an enormous amount of life there, and it all looked so healthy, and we wondered, you know, what you're doing to help the recovery and promote the health of the vegetation on the property. Like you hear about landscapes that have become dehydrated because of changed water flow across the country, and we're wondering how you're managing to keep the country healthy that way.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I failed to mention the vegetation monitoring as well. So we've got some very specific vegetation monitoring that happens across the reserve annually, and we partner with some external people as well that help us with that. But in terms of what Bush Heritage has done and what we are currently doing to help manage that, so the first step is really destocking the place, getting all the livestock off. Being the nature of the environment here with very low natural rainfall and no permanent natural water really helps us manage those grazing impacts as well from any wandering stock. Or, you know, I mentioned there's no goats in this region. Well, that's probably part of the reason, is that there's no permanent natural water. So that really helps. The rabbit management on a broad scale is really important for vegetation management. Rabbits, they're only small, but they eat a lot. I think 15 rabbits eat the equivalent of 1 sheep per day. So that's really important. And then we also do landscape rehydration, I guess, looking at, there's a lot of legacy erosion in this country with, tracks being put in areas that shouldn't have been put in, or just graders going through constantly over the years, regrading a road and lowering it down. And especially in environments like the chenopod shrublands, where it's very undulating, as soon as you drop down even a centimetre or 2, it funnels the water and sucks it out of the landscape. So we've got some methods which I know you guys have had a lot to do with over at Bullcomata, with using this, brush packing in those areas. But, there's also been bigger projects over the years where, for example, the old Stuart Highway, the old alignment of the Stuart Highway, we've got machinery in and built banks and things, and that's really successful. So it's slowly, with all of those different management actions, the vegetation is building up, the seed bank is building up, and as that happens, those cryptogams build up that I mentioned earlier, and we get more water infiltration, more vegetation, and it's just an ongoing cycle. And I think the ecologist, a few years ago, a former ecologist really mentioned that it was about 2016 or 17, he mentioned that he'd noticed a real sort of tipping point in the health of the landscape there, sort of 7 or 8 years after Bush Heritage changed the management of the property to conservation, and that it was really starting to exponentially get healthier. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question, Meredith. There's a lot going on there.
I can tell. And there's the bufflegrass under control. Like, we noticed it along the highway, which is where the problem is.
Yeah, so again, like the feral animals, we're very fortunate here in that we've got one main weed. It's a nasty one, but there's only one. And fortunately, it's not well established in this region either. The Stuart Highway does run through Bonbon, through the centre of Bonbon. So, normally this time of year, not so much 2020, but normally this time of year, there's hundreds of caravans going north and south along that highway, which is a major vector for weeds coming in and out. Bufflegrass, South Australia has declared bufflegrass a weed, but we're the only state that it's declared a weed. So in the Northern Territory, in Queensland and New South Wales, they still actively seed properties with this grass. It's considered a valuable pasture plant. But yes, we've been doing a lot of work on bufflegrass over the last 10 years, and I feel like we've got it under control. We know the areas, we know where the hotspots are, and that's part of the key, is knowing what you're dealing with. And when we get those rainfall events that spur the growth, then we can focus a couple of months on managing it, and we're getting there with it. But the Stuart Highway will always be a vector, unfortunately, I think.
Okay.
Meredith and Tony, so we can get to a few other questions. Can you ask one more?
I'll just ask one more quick question, really,
Thanks,
because I know you've got lots of questions. I know Clint and Kate really love Bonbon and love living there, and we just wondered what your hopes are for the future. Have you got any special hope for Bonbon in the future?
Yeah, I that's a good question, and we're fairly active in the local community here, which is a pastoral community. I think Bonbon is very important in that context as well. A lot of our neighbours drive through Bonbon to get to local events and things like that, and they see that difference that you saw when you came out here in the vegetation. So I think that alone is very important, that Bonbon can be a reference point for a bunch of things, but people might be able to look at the paddocks and look at what it could look like with no stock. So that's very important. I'd love to see, there's a lot of things that we don't know about the South Australian rangelands. wombats, sandalwood, thorny devils, you name it. There's tons of stuff. So it'd be great to see Bon being a research hub for this part of the rangelands. And also, you know, which we're kind of doing already, but I guess it would be great to see for our colleagues in the conservation industry and also the region in different sectors to see Bon and Bush Heritage as a testing ground and demonstration site for management techniques and tools, and you know, testing new and maybe out there ideas on how we might be able to do things, but also doing the things that we know work and doing them well as well. I think they're the sort of what I see, well, kind of all of Bush Heritage properties being really important for, but yeah, particularly Bon.
Thanks, Clint. That's really inspirational.
Thanks, Clint.
Yeah, love it. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Over to you, Luke. You're on mute.
Just got to get my mute button off. There's so many people here. I think we've still got over 95 participants around Australia, so fantastic. They've stuck with you, Clint, so that's impressive. So Meredith and Tony, thank you. That was wonderful to have that focus and those questions. And we've got a bit of time for a couple of other questions that I've been able to keep up with some of them, but there's a lot, and we're not going to get to all of them, but we've certainly got them here. And what we'll do is the questions we don't get to, we'll send out to you some responses, just so we can keep connected and keep you up to date with what you're interested in regarding Bon. But the first question, Clint, is about golden-shouldered parrots. Do you have any idea on what sort of numbers, or are there golden-shouldered parrots out that way? There was
Yeah, I'm certainly not the bird expert. Kate's our resident bird expert. But no, I don't think I'm pretty sure we don't get golden-shouldered parrots here. The parrots that we get are, Burke's parrot, mulga parrots, blue bonnets, little corellas, galahs, the odd major Mitchell cockatoo. Have I missed any? Look, I probably have, but I don't think
we'll get our ecologist Graham to maybe get a list of the parrots, and we can send it out following this, because there are so many species on these reserves. It's not expected to be able to name them all, but it was just an interesting question I thought that popped up. So we'll might add a list of the parrots to the feedback for all the participants. But that's the other question was just you've talked about the feral animal control. And obviously, we don't control feral animals just for the sake of it. It's a highly time and cost-intensive activity. And what Bush Heritage and others are trying to do is to bring back certain native species into the land that have been taken out. And one of the questions from our supporters has been just a little bit of an update on the Betong project and how that's going, or what we've learned from that over the last few years. It's a very complex project.
Yeah, it is. So that project, I guess, was a real catalyst to ramp up the predator management on Bon. And over the last 4 years, it has been developing. The drought has put a stall to that project in a sense. Our partners at Arid Recovery are working through that drought, and I won't go into that because it's not my realm to talk about. But basically, that project was a real catalyst for our predator management program, and we wanted to make sure that we were gathering as much information as we could to make our management adaptive and relevant and specific to the species. So we do a hell of a lot of monitoring regarding all the management actions that we do. So we've got a good understanding of, when we do our baiting, what is taking the baits, how often we're developing, how often we need to really get the desired outcomes. I mentioned that we're seeing an increase in thorny devil activity. In that area that we've seen that increase in thorny devil activity, there's also been increases in small mammal activity. It's really been hard to quantify that through the small mammal and reptile trapping, but just anecdotally through seeing more and more tracks on the sand dunes and on the vehicle tracks, we're noticing that. and you know, our fox detections in that area have over the last 4 years gone from using remote cameras. I think it was about 40 fox detections a month, down to we're at something like 0.2 fox detections per month now per 100 camera trap nights. So we've seen a really our predator management has been really impactful in that area, and we're seeing those great results through increased native animal activity.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, and the other interesting thing about that project that was, you know, led by Bonbon several years ago, and has had to adjust to the climate variability that we're all facing, and that as an organisation, I mentioned earlier, adapting to climate change is a key element of our risk management, and it varies across the country, as you can imagine, because what's happening in Tasmania is quite different to what's happening in the Kimberley and what's happening in Bonbon, and so we have to adapt our management of not just our feral animal control, but how we house and look after staff and volunteers in quite complex ways. And I think this feral animal question about how the foxes and the cats and the rabbits all interact, and how we effectively use our resources to control them rather than just doing simplistic methods is really exciting. And I'm seeing this kind of integrated scientific approach happening in South Australia, also in the southwest of Western Australia through our program down there, and also in the Midwest of WA. So we've got reserves in Bush Heritage all trialling these more integrated, scientifically driven ways, and it's really exciting. And the knowledge sharing between those regions is going to be very useful. So that's great to hear. Another question, Clint, can you get public transport out to Bonbon?
You can actually.
Yeah.
Well, you know, close enough. Because we're on the Stuart Highway, and the Greyhound bus goes from Adelaide to Alice Springs every night, and you can. The official stop is actually 20 kilometres up the Stuart Highway from our turnoff, but you can request to be dropped off at the mailbox. So basically, you can post yourself to Bonbon. Yeah.
There you go. Well, that's probably. There was one other question here that we've had the parrot in question is probably a mulga parrot. So there's a whole stream of conversations going on here. So we will definitely get that list, and there's been some requests for some other species lists that Graham and the team will help pull together for our supporters. So we love that you've got a deep interest in what's happening out there. There was one other question here about a feral-proof fence. Clint, I don't think there's any, well, I know there's no plans for doing that. We don't do that on our reserves at this point. It's not part of our plan. It's not how we operate. There's other organisations that do that type of work, and hence, in this case, why we've partnered with Arid Recovery, who do have fenced enclosures, and where our partnership with them, as Clint highlighted, is about taking any of the learnings and the opportunities that they have in their fenced enclosures out into the broader landscape, you know, obviously being Bonbon, but then hopefully other properties as well, because we are genuinely interested in doing the best conservation work we can on our reserves, but then sharing that and promoting that across the broader nation. So was there anything final, Clint or Meredith or Tony, that you'd like to say as I get ready to wrap up?
Yeah, Luke, I just wanted to, as a comment, not a question. People probably don't realise how difficult it is to control animals like foxes. And a graphic example of that is where, I think it was at Bonbon, where a fox was collared, and it went backwards and forwards down in the southwest corner, and then it just took off 120 kilometres north. I think that's right, isn't it, Clint? It's difficult to control such a mobile feral animal, I'm sure.
Yeah, so that's also part of what we're doing is that research component. So we did some GPS collaring of foxes last year, and yeah, that particular fox in question decided to go 140 kilometres. It was in a couple of days. So yeah, it's really interesting, and that knowledge, we just don't know enough really about the animals out here in the rangelands in particular. So any knowledge we can build on that is really important.
And I actually am going to squeeze one more in out of a long list. So that's a really interesting point about the complexity of fox management, but generally feral animal management is highly complex. You mentioned, Clint, the impact of pastoralism and hard-hoofed animals. Would you be able to just elaborate a little bit more on the impact that grazing had on the topsoil, and any other impacts that grazing has had on the natural values of Bonbon, and how that that legacy is persisting and changing? And you have touched on that, but if there's anything else you'd like to say about the grazing, and I think it's important to frame that in a sense that we work with a lot of agricultural neighbours and companies, and we value them as neighbours as well, and see a lot of good learnings and work that our agricultural partners do in looking after country. So it's about all working together in that regard. But anything specific about that historical pastoral legacy on Bonbon you'd like to add there, Clint?
Yeah, it is an important factor for the vegetation and soils in particular, and I will add to your comment just now, Luke, that it is great. I follow the regenerative agriculture sort of field, and there's really great developments and sort of mental shifts going on in that space, and there's some great work happening. But probably one of the biggest impacts in this environment is just permanent water points. So obviously livestock need to drink, and putting troughs in one place, even with animals moving them on and not leaving them in paddocks for too long, just really impacts it's a really fragile system. It's very resilient, but very fragile at the same time. So just a continual grazing around those water points, the compaction in the country, and it's particularly noticeable in the chenopod shrublands on buckshot plains here, where the livestock walk to and from the water. We call them sheep pads. It looks like someone's driven there, and everyone always asks what that is. And those stay in the landscape for a long time, just where the animals have continually walked, and again lowers that soil down a little bit, and they form little channels that suck the water out of the landscape and slowly dehydrate the whole landscape, which is a very slow process. So it's hard for us as relatively short-lived beings to notice those changes, but it's definitely happening. And also the with the permanent water supports unnaturally high numbers of macropods as well in the landscape, because in this environment there would have been a thunderstorm, and the grass would have grown. Where the grass grows, there's water nearby, and then everything would dry up, the grass would start to hay off, and the animals would move on. But with that permanent water in the landscape, they hang around, continually graze. So it is in the South Australian rangelands and the rangelands across the country, actually. There's a lot of efforts working on the kangaroo management at a broad scale as well, and trying to develop ethical and meaningful ways of managing those populations, which are unnaturally high.
Yeah, great. That's a great summary. Thank you, Clint. All right. Well, this is hard because there's so much more we'd like to share with you all, but we by these going well and by the involvement you've all shown, we can organise more of these into the future. So we look forward to connecting and sharing more of the work that's happening across Australia and the work that you're all enabling. And we really do appreciate that. And I mean it from my position and all of our staff, having the opportunity to connect with you all like this, just seeing all these names, Rosie and Annalie and Stephanie and David, all these names that some of us know and others that we don't, that are all helping us and enabling what we do, is so powerful. And don't ever underestimate the impact that has for us as individuals that are working day by day, but also as an organisation to have this connection with you all that make the conservation and cultural land management work we do possible. So on that note, I just really want to thank Meredith and Tony, for obvious reasons, for their support and contribution to bush heritage, but also for taking the time to contribute to this webinar. It means a lot, and it's been a pleasure. And also to Clint and Kate and the team at Bonbon for their commitment and hard work out there. And also Graham Finlayson, who's our ecologist, who's not on this webinar, but he's also a critical part of driving the program. And also Bruce Hammond, who's the regional healthy landscape manager for South Australia, who's recently been appointed. They're all key players in this. And I also want to thank Anna for pulling this together. Anna and the events team do a lot of hard work in getting all the technology right, getting all the run sheets right, and it all, you know, most people know how difficult it is to pull these things together. So I just really want to thank Anna and the marketing and fundraising team for all their work in making this possible. So on that note, thanks so much for spending a little bit over an hour with us, learning a bit more about Bonbon and how it's doing great work locally and also impacting on the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set. I think you can see when you add all those little properties up that we've got and all the information we're sharing between other conservation groups and pastoralists, that this is moving in the right direction, and we need that more than ever at this point in time. So until next time, have a great day, and we'll speak again soon. Thanks for your support.